This week on The Record, Missouri kicks off its election year session. Republicans in the supermajority turn their sights on each other. Can Republican leader Caleb Rowden keep a splintered Senate in line? He's on the record. And the renewed push for school choice. Will Democrats back an effort to spend public dollars on private schools? House Minority Leader Crystal Quaid on school choice and the pro-choice push to legalize abortion. She's on the record. It's all coming up right now. Welcome to The Record. I'm Mark Maxwell. This election year is underway in Jefferson City. Missouri Republicans caucus to nominate their pick for president in less than 8 weeks. We begin with Senate President Pro Tem Caleb Rowden, the Republican leader, who has a fresh squabble on his hands from a newly formed Freedom Caucus.
There was one group in particular that was being labeled as the terrorists. And when it was established that a third party, the State Freedom Caucus Network, looked at what was happening, the dysfunction in the state of Missouri, vetted us, looked at our voting records and said, would you all be interested in actually forming a Freedom Caucus? Here's the benefits of it.
It's a way to shine the light, to cut through the bull and all the minutia that we hear, oh, you're obstructionists. No. What this Freedom Caucus and what the national aspect is going to bring, it's going to shine the light as to who the real obstructionists are.
How divided are Senate Republicans right now?
Probably no more so than we've ever been. I mean, we've had good days and bad days over the course of the conservative caucus started 5 years ago when I first got elected into leadership, and ever since then they've had their kind of faction. It is what it is.
You're downplaying it a little bit, but when you have to whip the votes and you're looking at the board, would you rather negotiate with Mike Moon and Bill Eigel or some of the centrist Dems out there?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the issue. Sometimes, certainly, bringing Dems on board, if we're talking about, enhancing child care in Missouri or some of these things that a good number of Republicans have worked to do, it's easier to get Dem votes. There's no doubt about that. But there's certain days where, it's a kind of a traditional R versus D fight.
On school choice, some Democrats are open-minded to that.
Yeah. And school choice, I think, is an interesting one because you got rural Republicans who are, some of them are not in love with the idea of expanding into their neck of the woods, and then some Democrats who already have charter schools and now have ESAs in their backyard that are, maybe more inclined to let that expand around the state. So it depends on the issue.
A lot of liberty-loving founding fathers and Republicans, they drew a really bright red line between the church and the state. And on this issue of public schools especially, they said there should be a public school system. What's your guiding light? What's your line? How do you protect that separation? Public dollars going to private schools?
I am as pro-public education as anybody, right?
But where's the public clamoring for this? Is it really coming from the grassroots, or is it coming from outside groups coming in here?
I see it. In COVID, I think brightened some pretty significant issues inside of public education. Now I see it more, and Columbia and Boone County have always been, and still to this day, are very pro-public education. I hear more about needing more choice options from people in Columbia, some of which I know to be liberal, some of which I know to be, traditional public school champions now that are saying, hey, look, this ain't working anymore. We got to do something different. So I'm hearing it from places that I wasn't hearing it from 6 to 8 years ago, which I think is indicative of a trend that's moving that direction.
Just so I hear you clearly, they come to you and say the problem is what?
Well, they need more choice. The fundamental problem in Missouri is that outside of Kansas City and St. Louis right now, if you are in a failing school, you don't have any way out unless your parents are rich. That's it. I think that's just a fundamental flaw in the system, and I think we should fix it.
This election year. We've heard everybody talk about it as we kick off this legislative session. There's a lot of attention around this abortion question. Do you want to see an abortion question of some kind on the ballot? Do you want the voting public to weigh in on this issue?
I don't know that I have an opinion about wanting or not wanting. The legislature made our voice heard a few years ago via the heartbeat bill.
Do you think the public agrees with that position?
They sent us all back here. Every single person that voted for that bill came back, including me in Columbia, Missouri. So I think the pro-life general topic is much more nuanced than as it relates to public perception and public opinion than it's talked about in this building or kind of talked about in the political sphere. The way I describe it is I think 60 to 65% of Missouri probably claims to be pro-life. What that means to them and to what level they're willing to go, i.e. exceptions and some of these other things, that's where the variance comes, right? But I think 65% of the state, maybe even 70% of the state, would say that they're pro-life. So, you know, if it gets on the ballot, they get to have their voices heard. I don't know, depending on, I think I've said this a few other places, if the Dems or the pro-choice, you know, folks that are writing the question, if they get greedy, they're probably going to lose. If they try to be a little more nuanced, a little more middle of the road as far as what that question would say, you know, then I think Missouri would have a chance to win that fight at the ballot.
I wonder if voters are curious to know where you stand. Some Republicans, I'm going to name some, Donald Trump, Josh Hawley, Mike Kehoe, they would support some exceptions in the case of rape, incest, the life of the mother, and maybe even up to that. I think Nikki Haley would support up to 12 weeks of a pregnancy, she said recently. There's a Republican organization right now circulating petitions to put a question like that on the ballot. Could you support something like that?
I think the way that I described my position on the heartbeat bill is which is what the thing that was in front of me, was if there weren't any exceptions in that particular bill, I voted for that bill. If there had been exceptions in that bill, I still would have voted for that bill. Hypothetically, what ends up being on the ballot, I don't think I could say until I see exactly what's in there. But you know, I think it's for me, part of it is I have personal convictions. You know, part of that comes from just my background, my faith background, my belief of when life begins, etc. But there's the second question of the government's role, right?
So if it's that tough, and you've been wrestling with these big questions about life and abortion for so long in here as an elected official, what would be wrong with saying, let's let the voters weigh in here?
I don't know that there's anything wrong with it.
When I asked you if you wanted to see that question on the ballot,
well, they're either going to get the signatures or they're not. It's not up to me to decide if it's going to be on the ballot or not. So.
Would you sign one of those petitions to put a question on the ballot?
I've never signed a petition in my life. I wouldn't start now.
But you're not going to campaign against it?
No, I certainly wouldn't campaign against it.
One of the reasons I'm asking this line of questioning,
and
one of the reasons why our viewers might be curious to know where you stand on this issue, is because there's going to be a renewed fight to make it harder to change the Constitution in this building this year.
Yeah.
Are you going to be behind that effort to make it harder to change the Constitution?
Yeah. No, I've gone back and forth on this issue a little bit. I said it this way last year. I do think changing the Constitution with a simple majority has ended up creating some challenges for our current Constitution. The current Constitution is bloated. There's any number of things. Yeah, I mean, the marijuana stuff shouldn't be in there. The bingo language that's in there shouldn't be in there. It's getting bigger, and it continues to get bigger. I do think that's a problem. I also struggle with the idea that we should, in an effort to, kind of submit our will and thrust our will on voters, we're going to make it harder for them to do it. It's tough for me personally. I know it's a priority of some folks in our caucus. You're going to see IP reform in some form or fashion on the Senate floor. I assume it gets out of the House. I don't know if it passes or not.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, you bet.
We talked to Senator Rowden Wednesday. That full extended interview up on KSDK.com, where you can also find more articles and full interviews if you text the word record to 314-425-5355. She's running for governor, Missouri Minority Leader Crystal Quaid. On the record next. As the Missouri House kicked off in this new year, Republican Speaker Dean Plocher warned about that kind of blinding ambition that can often seduce politicians into pandering during an election year. He said if that splintered Senate remains divided, Republicans may end up hurting their chances to beat back a push to legalize abortion. Republicans plan to make one last stand, one final push to make it harder to do that, to change the Constitution, right as pro-choice groups are already organizing behind that effort. So I asked the Speaker, is it fair to change those rules in the middle of this game?
We protected life. In fact, in 2023, there were 0 abortions performed in the state of Missouri. I would love to see initiative petition reform on the ballot in August that we pass out of the House or the Senate, whatever we can agree on. I stand for life, and this is yet one more reason why we should have passed initiative petition reform years ago.
They call it initiative petition reform. I call it attack on democracy, but whatever. But we do know, looking at states like Ohio and other places that have tried to do this, voters simply don't want it.
When voters do go to the ballot box this year, either in August or again in November. Is there any issue more important than the abortion question this year?
I don't think so.
Give us some predictions. When do we see an abortion question on the ballot? August? November?
Well, so that is the topic of conversation that everyone keeps saying. And, the governor gets to determine what that looks like.
But Democrats haven't been able to agree on a petition yet, on a question, the language of a question.
I would push back on that a little bit. I think that advocates...
They have agreed?
I think that advocates are struggling on which direction that we should go. I wouldn't say Democrats as a whole. As a Democrat, I want something to come forward, and we'll see which one comes forward. Of course, I have preferences, but if one goes forward that is a little bit more restrictive, you're going to see a lot of Democrats still support that. So I would counter that.
Including the one that's out there right now, the Republican-backed 12-week?
I think that you'll see some Democrats support that, yeah. But it
Could
depends.
that pass in Missouri?
The numbers that I have seen indicate that the more expansive version is more palatable for folks. And I think we look at Ohio, we look at other states who've had similar language. But at the end of the day, what I really think it's about is that Missourians don't want government coming into their doctor's offices and telling them what to do, period. Whether that's with abortion, whether or not I get cancer treatment. We want to have government to stay out of our business. And so when we look at the languages, the more baseline, broad, trusting doctors to do their jobs and trusting Missourians to know what's best for themselves is something that I think is more palatable for people.
But I can already hear the Republican campaign operatives writing their ad. If they hear you say that, they're going to say that means that Crystal Quaid and Missouri Democrats want to go all the way up to abortions right up to birth. And you've heard late-term abortion, all these different terms you've heard in campaigns. How do you compete against those narratives, which are probably being spun up right now?
I trust voters. And that's the difference between me and my counterparts on the other side of the aisle. I trust them to have a voice and to know what's best for them. That's why I want this to go to a vote of the people while you see Republicans trying to stifle this every step of the way. People should be able to decide. And so there's going to be campaign rhetoric. There's going to be millions of dollars spent on this. But we look at every other state that has done this, and they can say whatever talking point they want. Missourians know what's best for themselves.
Would you rather run against Jay Ashcroft than Mike Kehoe?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Lieutenant Governor Kehoe and I get along very well, and we have worked on issues here, and I think that he is a good statesman. Secretary Ashcroft and I disagree on a lot of things. My answer to that, to be very honest with you, depends on if I have my citizen hat on or my campaign hat on. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, what's going on in Jefferson City, and we've already talked about the chaos that happens here, any Republican governor is going to sign the most egregious and extreme bills that make it out of this building. They're not going to push back against their own party. We've seen it over the past few years. And so that is why, regardless of who the Republican nominee is, I think that would serve better, because we need to be holding this extremism back to the middle. Missourians want middle, and they don't want this extremism. And I say that as someone who grew up in Southwest Missouri, in a really rural part of our state. Folks are tired of this divisiveness, and that's what concerns me about whichever Republican wins that nomination.
Let's switch gears back from the campaign trail to the business in this building before we wrap this up. Yeah. I'm hearing a lot of discussion around this school choice issue. Mm-hmm. I know you don't speak for the whole caucus, and you have to speak for the whole caucus, so I want to set that aside for a minute and just learn more about what you think on this issue. Should a taxpayer who pays property taxes, pays personal property taxes, and also doesn't see a lot of options in their neighborhood and prefers to send their kid to a private school, should they have the choice to reap some of their tax money back and say, let's put that money to this school, if that's the personal family's preference? Should they have that choice?
I don't think that is an answer that can be said by yes or no. And let me expand on that, because I think that there could be conversation around choice if these private entities were held to the same standards that our public schools were. Locally elected school boards, same accreditation standards, same standards for what the kiddos have to learn in the classroom. That is the difference between public education and using taxpayer money to funnel to all these other places.
Do you see it as a separation of church and state issue?
Not so much, no. I think what is important for me about this conversation is one of the things that sets America apart as a country is the fact that every child, regardless of background, region, ability, has access to education free. It's entitled to them. Of course, through taxpayer money, nothing is free, but every child, regardless of their background, is entitled to a public education. And that is something that is cherished, and that's something that I personally deeply cherish. And what concerns me about taking public dollars and moving them around to private entities who are not held to the same standards is that we are going to have children left behind. So when I say not yes or no, is if the conversation was about adding the same standards to these private entities and having locally elected school boards where local parents can have a say on what's going on. That's a different conversation than just taking money and moving it to a private entity. The things that I am seeing proposed right now, I don't support. I think that there are ways to do choice within the public school system that our kids can thrive in. Springfield Public Schools, where I represent, is a great example of that. We're the largest school district in the state, and we have choice programming within our public education system. My stepdaughter went through the STEM program and spent her entire fifth grade year at our Discovery Center, which is our science center in Springfield. We have partnerships with Bass Pro Shops, with our hospital systems, so that kiddos with our theater. Now, it's a lottery system, so it's not available to everyone, and that's something that we have growth within that we need. That is a way where public education and locally elected school boards, the folks who get to vote, our local community gets to vote on who those people are to dictate what that choice program looks like for their children. And so there are ways to do this within the public sector that holds the same standards, that gives every child the opportunity to go through that system.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's a thorny issue, a lot of different avenues to go down, but there is a path that you could support some version of school choice, if I'm hearing you correctly. If it came with the proper...
Yeah, I hesitate to say that I could support school choice because every school choice bill that I have seen presented in the Missouri legislature has not been one that I would support.
Because the standards weren't adequate enough to your liking.
Absolutely. I think, again, when we're using taxpayer money, we need to make sure that no child is left behind and that we can hold folks accountable.
Aren't some children being left behind in public schools today?
Absolutely they are. But the difference is we're not picking and choosing which children are left behind. And that's what concerns me about some of the options that have been presented thus far. If you have an active parent who is really engaged and can do and doesn't have to work 3 jobs to survive, then that child is going to have a better chance of getting into these private schools, into these choice schools. If you're a kid who has different abilities, they don't necessarily have to be accepted into these private entities. And those are all things that really deeply concern me about the proposals that I've seen so far.
Very interesting. Thanks for taking some time for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
The latest state to try and keep former President Donald Trump off its ballot. Former President Donald Trump faces a new formal challenge to his candidacy, this time in Illinois. 5 citizens, filed this week in Chicago, claiming the Constitution's ban on insurrection disqualifies Trump from the ballot. The state Supreme Court could eventually rule on that case if the State Board of Elections doesn't. Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court likely will. Governor Mike Parson signed an executive order this week banning certain individuals and businesses from buying agricultural land within 10 miles of critical military sites. The order singles out nations designated as foreign adversaries like North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran. This week, a federal judge granted former Illinois House Speaker Mike Madigan's request to delay his bribery and racketeering trial. Madigan is facing a 23-count racketeering, bribery, and conspiracy indictment. When we come back, we check the record after a new formation of a Freedom Caucus in Missouri. An interesting exchange broke out on the floor of the Missouri Senate Wednesday. Senators Rick Bratton and Nick Schroer were spelling out their reasons for forming a new Freedom Caucus. They flinched and objected at being labeled legislative terrorists or obstructionists. Apparently, the 2 men were struggling to comprehend why their opinions weren't shared by the majority of their colleagues in the Senate. That's when Senator Schroer said this.
The time for statesmanship is over.
Senator Schroer may have given up on statesmanship. Let's hear from someone who never did. In his first inaugural address in 1861, as the nation was heading to war with itself, President Abraham Lincoln said, "You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." He said, "We're not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." Lincoln acknowledged what Schroer has not, that unity and democracy and legislative debate not only understands that we have differences of opinion, it relies on those differences and depends on statesmen and women working through them to keep the peace and uphold the rule of law. That's the whole job, after all. Differ we must. That's all of our time this week. Remember, our extended interviews are up on our website, ksdk.com. Next week, we head across the river to Illinois, where they kick off their legislative year, and after that, the Iowa caucuses. Until then, we're off the record.